Christian, could you get them in? Okay, we better get going. Time is not on our side. Hello? Please sit down. Okay, well, welcome everyone. As usual, on a rather cold Melbourne night, but those joining us interstate may be enjoying greener pastures, I don't know. But in any case, wherever you are, welcome. And we're in the home stretch, but some very important things still to think about, reflect, discuss, and perhaps look forward to. Well, let me first of all say just a couple of words about the assignments, as we call them, that have come in. The first thing that perhaps I should say, I'm very pleased to have received as many as I have. I wasn't sure how many would come, but I haven't read them all, but I've read about half of them, probably getting close to 60. So those who have not yet put it in, it's not too late. I know some people have struggled with getting 3 conversations together, but that doesn't matter. The important thing is reflections on your efforts, even if they weren't, they didn't result in extensive conversation with one group or with one person. It doesn't matter. It's the reflections that are so important, and reflections on how it went. So, of course, they varied widely. What I'm going to do after I've read them all is to write a page of 2 by way of more careful observations than what I'm going to say for a minute or 2 today, and send them to everyone. I think that's a much better way of you getting some response to what you've been doing. Okay, just a couple of things. They varied widely from 3 or 4 lines to 2 pages plus. Okay, so that's all right, variety. I think a lot of people were able to get 3 conversations, even if they didn't last 20 minutes, that doesn't matter. I think it's fair to say that people were more successful at getting the conversations going than at facilitating them as well as they would have wished, although in some cases they went very well. They were lively and they were not too much question and answer. Part of the problem was probably me by putting up questions. I should have tried to, even though I said don't put them in the form of a question, nevertheless, the fact that there were questions, they were a question mark, meant that a number of you were inclined to use some version of those questions. And that may have hampered the free-flowing conversation. So I'm partly to blame for that. But where I think, so there were many strengths in terms, one, of getting conversations going, in some cases with a good spread of different age groups. What I could not glean from most of the reports was whether there was much by way of an intercultural spread in the 2, 3, or 4 or 5 people you spoke with. That would have been an interesting reflection. The other thing that's worth saying is that the self-reflection could be sharper. I'm generalizing. Of course, there were some that were very good. Self-reflection by way of saying, this is where I think, in the light of the conversation, I think people were coming from. This is the kind of background which would have prompted them to respond in the way they did. But of course, the conversation may not have taken that kind of turn which would enable you to do that, right? After all, the position one takes on most issues is the product of one's socialization over time. We're all the product, to a large extent, of our environment, social, cultural environment. So in a way, it's useful to situate what one is saying when one's listening carefully to the social environment that has been the experience of that person. Of course, when you're dealing with a close friend or someone in the family, you can assume you know a fair bit about that environment. But with those you don't know so well, a colleague at work, that's useful to allow that to come up. So if someone puts forward a view about something, one useful thought is, have you always held to this kind of view? Or have you changed your position on some things over time? Very interesting. It's a very telling question. And it probably, they will say, oh, I don't know. I haven't thought about it. But that's all right. You can pursue it. Did you have views when you were at school or at university or wherever? And okay, so that's one thing. The other thing that I think is very interesting in conversation, of course, this was an effort. It was assignment oriented. And I think for some people, it was an innovation of a kind. The thing is how now to do it in ways that where the novelty has gone and one does it more and more as second nature, not question and answer. One way to do this is to say, in your own words, to suit your style, your approach. I was reading yesterday, or the day before, or I was watching a program, might have been news, and this message kept coming across. I didn't know what to make of it. I just didn't know what to make of it. Stop, no question. And let's see how the other person takes that up on. I didn't know what to make of it. They'll jump. They'll say, oh, that's what that meant. And then you'll get them going. So it doesn't have to be a question. It could be a statement that invites a response. And anyhow, so I'll have more to say when I've read them all. I've read about 25 or so. I've got about 35 to go, and any latecomers that may come in the last in the next few days. All right. Now we're going to have a very tight schedule as usual, as tight as any previous one. I'll go for about 20 minutes, then we'll have 15 minutes in conversation, and then we have to come back because that's when our speaker will be. So we'll have to be seated between 6:45 and 7:13 to 7. Okay, between 15 to and 13 to, all right? Because he will be waiting for us. I think I expect him to be fairly punctual. Okay. So what I'm going to be talking about today, this first round, briefly, as quickly, but not too quickly as I can, is to see how the world has changed, repeating one or two things that have already come up, a few other things to add to that, and then to ask the question, what are the implications for citizenship, to use the old word, or as some people prefer to call it now, civic engagement. All right. The first proposition I want to put to you is the most important. Our world has radically changed over the last 200 years. And therefore, so must the idea and practice of citizenship or civic engagement. It can't be what people thought the way people thought it would work 100 or 150 years ago. This has been one of the most tumultuous periods of human history, the last 150, 200 years. One of the most important British historians puts it this way. He has written 4 books, Hobsbawm, 4 books, and here they are. The 3 is the first trilogy. The Age of Revolution, you see the dates, the Industrial Revolution and the Rise of Capital in a Significant Way, the Age of Empire, the rise of empires across Africa, Asia, particularly France, but importantly, Britain, the British Empire, the empire over which the sun never set. And then he followed it up with a 4th, thank you, the Age of Extremes, 1914, 1991, and the 5 things that he thinks were standout trends of that period was catastrophic fascism, the failure of communism, because that's the period when communism came to pass, the failure of free market capitalism, the emergence of total war for the first time in human history, World War I, World War II, and the use of the nuclear weapon, and the decline of empire, because he could see it very clearly, the writing on the wall. Okay, so since 1945, there are 3, in fact, standout trends that I want to look at today. The first one, imperial decline, the decline of empire, and the 2 most obvious and important empires, the British Empire, which went first, and secondly, the American Empire, which is now in rapid decline, and is foreshadowing and reflecting the gradual decline of the West. It doesn't mean that the US, the West more generally, and even Britain don't still flex muscle, a lot of muscle. But there is decline compared to the heyday. So what we're seeing, and I'm not going to spend much time on it now, is a seismic shift, but it's more than a power shift. Why do I say that? Because there have been many power shifts in the last 200 years, 300 or 400 years. Portuguese Empire, the Dutch Empire, Portuguese, Spanish empires, Dutch Empire, French Empire, British Empire, American Empire, right? That's the succession, historically. All of them Western European. And now that that's shifting, it is shifting for the first time in 400 years or more from west to east. And that's a very bitter pill to swallow for those who are in the West. Very bitter pill. Unknown, unfamiliar, extraordinary. unpleasant, the source of anxiety, great anxiety. So that's one. We can come back to it later, which doesn't mean that the West is still not acting as if it was still dominant. Not at all. But whether it is actually dominant or it is just acting as if it were are two different things. Okay, the second thing which stands out, right? The second thing are cross-border flows. Everything flows now across borders, everything. The most obvious things I've named: people, mass migration, mass displacement of people in the tens and tens of millions. Goods and services, we know, exponential increase in trade, the flow of capital, of money. Money is now, the transactions are nothing short of extraordinary and unimaginable, even 30 years ago, let alone 100 years ago. Technology, weapons of all descriptions, information, of course, images, carbon emission, viruses, everything flows and does not respect borders. And nothing can stop them. You can't put a fence against carbon emissions. Say, but not here, please. Otherwise, we'll shoot you. It's ridiculous. You can't do it. You can't do that to viruses. So what we're seeing is the flow across borders at ever-increasing volume, the scale unimaginable, speed virtually instantaneous, and intensity. Okay. That is a defining feature of life now. It has been for a little while. All right, so next. Third trend, have to hurry it up. We're seeing the resurgence of old identities and the rise of new ones on a massive scale. Massive. Religious identities, think Muslim, the rise of Islam on the global stage. Ethnic identities, tribal, racial, cultural, ecological identities. Okay? And it affects all countries. One of these, or more of these, affects all countries, including the most advanced industrialized countries in the world. I think Belgium, think Spain, think Britain, Northern Ireland, Scotland. Scotland will go soon. Think Pakistan. Think a number of African states. And the story goes on in every continent. Of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which led to 15 republics plus Russia. And some of these 15 republics are now imploding, themselves breaking up. The complete breakup of the former Yugoslavia, and then the breakup of the bits that made up Yugoslavia. Everywhere, everywhere there are racial, ethnic, religious, tribal, cultural, and deep ecological tensions. And what does this do? It terribly weakens and fractures the nation state. The nation state is a shadow of what it used to be, a shadow. Even when they parade power, it's not real power. There are powers behind them that use the state as the front piece. So we have this picture of what is happening. Yes, the national, these are arenas of governance, okay? All of these shapes, the 5 shapes, are arenas of governance. What has happened is that national, which if you're thinking in terms of scale, 100 years ago, 50, even 50 years ago, would have taken the entire wall, that circle called national. It has now shrunk and is shrinking and shrinking, and it's fragmenting right through in the middle. It's shrinking and fragmenting in importance. It's still the biggest. That's the trend. And these others have been rising almost in every instance. Municipal arena, the provincial, which means things like the state of Victoria or the province of Ontario in Canada, etc. Provinces, states, they go by different names. Provincial is the most frequent. And then national, we know that. And then regional, European Union, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Pacific Islands Forum, etc., etc. So the Chinese foreign minister, who's an extremely busy man, takes time to meet the regional body of the Pacific Islands and gives them a full day. And he doesn't give many people a full day. Pacific Islands, barely 2 million people. Regional, very important. And then the international, World Health Organization, World Trade Organization, IMF, UN system, blah, blah. Okay? All rising in importance to greater or lesser extent at the expense of the state, the nation state. And that's why you can't put all your eggs in the one basket called the national basket. Doesn't mean you neglect the national basket. It's still terribly important, but it's one of several baskets, each of which has its own importance. Okay, next. Now, don't be frightened by the next diagram. It's as simple as pie. Okay, so there you are, the 5 tiers I've just talked about: local, provincial, national, regional, and international. The tiers of layered triangles. One side, that's governance. Public bodies that are supposedly there to make decisions on behalf of the population and the space they occupy, whether it's local, provincial, national, regional, or international. Public governance bodies, local council, the government of the state of Victoria, the state at the national level, Australia, if it is Australia we're looking at, and then regional and international. But that's one side of the triangle. Don't ever forget the other two. One is already more important than that side of the triangle, and that's the market. The market. The big players in the arena we call the market, especially the free market, so-called free market, better expressed as the unfettered market, the unregulated market, or not well-regulated market, because the market is exerting so much pressure that public governance is struggling to keep any form of regulation going over the market. And then civil society, which is the organized elements of society that don't fall into these two arenas. So, Amnesty International, Greenpeace, Human Rights Watch, professional associations, this, that, and the other, tens, hundreds of thousands of organizations, some local, national, international, civil society. So these are the 3 arenas, and each are operating at 5 layers, at least. Why do I bother with all this? Because citizenship, civic engagement has to be on top of all that I've shown. Otherwise, it's not worth a crumpet. Not worth a crumpet. You think you're in part of a social movement or organization and you're on top of it, not unless you understand what has just been shown. I can assure you, not worth it. It doesn't mean one doesn't keep going, working on climate change, this, that, and the other, but you have to understand that that's the context. And the strategy that's being pursued has to know how all of that is going to be dealt with, okay? All right, Now, five minutes on citizenship. I'll come back to it later. Next, yes. So what does it mean for citizenship? And especially if we're thinking of citizenship in a democratic setting. Well, the first thing that's important in this is that when one speaks of civic engagement, one does not just speak of the individual as citizen. Yes, there's that element, but the other element, in some respects more important, is the social person. The citizenship that comes with all the diverse identities, solidarities, affiliations we have. Whether it is a religious affiliation, even a sporting affiliation, all the affiliations we have, formal and informal. Citizenship has to bring all that into play. And therefore, it has to deal with difference at both levels. The civic engagement, I'm going to call it civic engagement from now on, has to operate at all those levels. And the only way it can be done is by expressing difference and negotiating it. Because difference is inescapable and unavoidable at all levels, from the local right through to the global. That, therefore, means citizenship has to be dialogical today. It has to be dialogical. And therefore, civic engagement has to be dialogical, and it must be animated, driven, if it is to be true to its potential, to a common search for truth and the common good. Okay. All right, next. So, civic engagement doesn't amount to much, especially in a democratic setting, unless it is moving towards truth and so on. And therefore, it has to be at its base, fundamentally ethical. Ethical. There is no such thing as unethical civic engagement. There is engagement, but it's not civic if it's not ethical. So, dialogical citizenship has to express and accommodate, next one, both difference and commonality. Just think of multicultural Australia. Just think of Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia. Difference has to be accommodated. What we've heard about the Uluru Statement, the voice from the heart, is but one very small step in this direction. And even now, we don't know how it will go. But civic engagement has to deal with that. Different languages, different cultures, different traditions, perspectives, and the lot. But difference is no impediment to dialogue, and therefore no impediment to civic engagement. I'm going to skip the next one because time is running out. You can look at it when I send out the slides. Except to say that civic engagement requires dialogue in reflection, dialogue in analysis, of course, dialogue in conversation, and it leads to the dialogue of action. But that's a bit theoretical. So we need to be dialogically engaged at all levels, from the local and everything to the global and everything in between. Think globally, act locally is a terrible, terrible slogan. It is so superficial, it's hardly worth the incinerator. Just no idea at all. It's got to be all five. And you think at all five, and you act at all five. Don't think at one and act on the other. Ridiculous. And I'll just give you an example of one attempt. There are dozens and dozens of attempts around the world to put this into practice, even when states and governments are not terribly sympathetic. So we'll have a look at this video clip. Just one. It's a French initiative, but has gone global. And will just show us one little thing that they are on about. It's called Mission Publique, public missions. They've got the triangle. What more can one ask for? There's so much more to say, but not enough time in which to say it. But I'm keen for the discussion to get underway. So we're going to skip a couple of slides and we'll go to our conversation groups. You can look at the slides at your leisure in the next few days. So conversation groups, we've got 13 minutes. That's it. Just two questions. Is this idea of civic engagement or citizenship as a dialogical exercise relevant to our times? Is it feasible? And yes, no, and reasons, no doubt. How can we, if it is of any use, can the idea be promoted? Has conversation and education a part to play? We may not be able to get through all these questions, but let's go have an initial start and we can then keep talking about it a little bit later in the evening. All right? All right. Very simple little questions.
Hi again.
Anthony Nicola. Oh, what I've been doing is actually
Chandran, can you hear me?
putting your vote in the ballot boxes and you really require to participate.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes. Can you hear me?
Nice to see you. Yes, I can hear you well and clear.
Oh, that's good. Nice to meet you and thank you for the invitation.
Oh, it's our pleasure. We start in about 4 minutes or so.
Sure. Thank you.
They're just having a brief discussion in groups.
Thank you.
I'm sorry to break up the party. I'm sorry. I know it could have gone on much longer. Okay. Well, thank you, friends. I now would like to introduce to everyone Chandran Nair. He's the founder, and if I may just say a couple of things about him so you can place him in context. He's the founder and CEO of the Global Institute for Tomorrow, an independent Pan-Asian think tank committed to understanding the relationship, exactly as we've been talking, between business, the market, society, and the state, and reshaping the rules of global capitalism. Biochemical engineer by training, he was chairman of the Environmental Resources Management in Asia Pacific until 2004, establishing the company as Asia's leading environmental consultancy. He's a member of the executive committee of the Club of Rome. He has served as adjunct professor at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology and the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, a regular speaker at many forums, including the World Economic Forum, and he's the author of the recently published Dismantling Global White Privilege, Equity for a Post-Western World, which will no doubt feature in our discussion. Chandran, we're delighted to have you with us. We're so pleased you're able to join us.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. Thank you very much.
Now, as you can see, we have a number of people physically present here with us in Melbourne, and quite a number attending online from different parts of Australia and elsewhere. So let me first of all give you the floor, so to speak, and speak about some of the issues that we have discussed in our correspondence. Play it as you wish, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation and open it up to questions from our participants. So over to you, Chandran.
Well, thank you very much, and a good day to everyone. Perhaps I could take just a few minutes to describe what prompted me to write the book on dismantling global white privilege, and then some of the reactions, and then open the flow up for questions and a discussion. As you all know, I think it was just last week was the second anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, and in the United States. And during 2020, there was a world sort of awakening around the issue of what was happening to people, Black people in the United States, Black Lives Matter, etc. And there was a sort of discussion going on, particularly in the Western world, about the whole issue of the issue of colonization and the what was termed sort of racism and the colonial sort of hangover from those times. Much of the discussion then, I thought, became slightly narrow-minded in my view, because in the UK and parts of Europe, the Black Lives Matter movement was adopted by many as a symbol of solidarity with people in the world, and resulted in discussions about taking down flags and statues and things like that, rather than what I thought needed to be a more substantive discussion about essentially what is the nature of white privilege. And in the United States, of course, it had essentially been a discussion about police brutality and systemic racism, yet even the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States was very much focused on attaining equal status, as important as it is with the white population and the white power structures. At that point, I was having thoughts about trying to engage in this discussion, and then urged by many friends in this part of the world, given that I'd spent a fair amount of time around the world in Europe, and I also lived in Africa during the anti-apartheid era, and just thought I should contribute to this discussion because it goes well beyond something to do with taking down the flags or statues, and taking a knee at a sports event or discussing the fact that more Black actors and actresses should get awards at the Oscars, which seemed to me as a very trivial way of capturing a much wider discussion. So I wrote a piece that essentially said that actually white privilege is pervasive around the world, and it is essentially woven into the very fabric of globalization. And that piece was essentially printed by a leading newspaper in Asia called the South China Morning Post. Interestingly, most leading Western newspapers, the editors of whom I know, some of them, refused to publish something like that because it seemed to cut rather deep. But the South China Morning Post published it, called it 50 Shades of White, because I pointed to 50 areas in which white privilege was so woven into the fabric of the global world we live in that people just took it for granted. And it was the first time that someone had actually moved beyond the sort of nod towards racism, etc. And was actually saying that beyond racism and acknowledging, it was very easy for CNN anchors to say, yes, of course, I'll take a knee with the Black basketball player or the football player, etc. But what was more uncomfortable was to accept a dissection of an argument around that what is the source of your very privilege? And that is essentially whiteness. But whiteness goes beyond skin color. And I also started to dissect how, after centuries of colonization, etc., Asians, Africans, others actually sought whiteness because whiteness essentially closed the power gradient. So if you an Asian who migrated to Australia, you sought to even change your name so that you could essentially seek proximity to whiteness. So don't be called Krishna, be called Chris. That became easier. And so I started to look at all of these things. And my publisher, who's in the United States, the publisher of my second book, called me up and said, hey, do you want to turn this into a book? Because I had never thought of turning it into a book. It was just an article. And he said, in the United States, we don't even have this discussion. All we have is police brutality and the sort of institutional racism. And you have dissected it in ways that we need to think about. So after a couple of days of thinking, I decided I'd write the book. And I wrote the book. And let me conclude by saying, so I dissected it into how white privilege is essentially enmeshed part of the fabric of the world we live in today, from essentially 9 spheres of what I call the globalized world. Everything from geopolitics, can I politely say the distorted sort of prominence that Australia has in geopolitics, despite being a population of 20 million people. Its alliance with essentially the Anglo-Saxon white tribe of the Five Eyes. All of this is part of the white privilege and preservation. So talking about geopolitics, the role of business, essentially all the leading accounting firms, investment firms, etc., all Western or white men led, and essentially gatekeepers of the entire financial system. They decide who can be sanctioned, who cannot, which company will be IPO, which will not be, etc. And then I dissected it right through the teaching of history, the denial of essentially the cultures of others, media, and then into other areas that people normally don't speak about, which include sports, music, pop culture, and then finally fashion and even the environment. And the idea was to essentially not be divisive, as some people tend to think it was, but to essentially put together a narrative that will enable us to have a much more cultured and more global discussion than that is presently had, which is a simple discussion about race and racism. So that's perhaps, Professor, my kind of opening gambit about what I'd like to share. The book has been well received, was reviewed in the FT, etc. But I've also had hate mails that you might expect. So that's part and parcel of the game. But it's opened up a new discourse, and I hope it provides an opportunity for people to start to talk about power. And finally, my point is that the core argument in the book that white privilege is essentially the best way to understand it is the desire of dominant Western economies to essentially preserve privileges that allow them to dominate the world economy and therefore essentially enjoy the privileges of that dominance. And the United States is essentially the apex leader of that effort to maintain that historical privilege.
Thanks, Chandran. I'm going to try and put a couple of questions to you first before opening it up to questions from both our online and our in-person participants. So you make the point, which I think is very telling, that there's this history of white privilege and white colonization going back much more than 200 years. And we've been talking a little bit about that in the last few weeks. But on the other hand, there is a rise going on, at least at the economic level, especially in Asia, but also in some other places, parts of Latin America. In other words, yes, there may be a commitment by those who are on the top of the pyramid of white privilege to maintain it by any means they have at their disposal. But on the other hand, there is a decline, relatively speaking, going on as we speak. How do you respond to that proposition?
I would suggest it's not a decline, it's just a leveling out. We have to understand that Western populations constitute 15% of the world. So if there's a decline is perceived in the Western world, was actually a major realignment, a recalibration. And the angst that the Americans in particular have at the moment, and therefore seeing the rise of China is essentially a threat to them, is essentially a small population of the world having had a belief in their innate superiority, economic prominence, etc., emboldened by their military power, is that they will have to share. The inability to share with others is essentially the basis of much racism and essentially the maintenance of one's privilege. So if, and I understand the concerns that people who've had privileges will have when their privileges are being eroded, of course, but it's not tolerable. It doesn't make it fair. I understand that, but if you take the United States and Australia, basically white settler communities, then they are going to have to deal with a new world. The desire to preserve the privileges is, of course, natural. People who have been at the top of the tree are not going to give up those privileges easy, but don't ask me to be sympathetic. I'm more interested in how we build a post-Western world which is more equitable. And that equitable world is one in which is inhabited by, at the moment, something like, out of a population of 8 billion, something like more than 6.5 billion people. Their rise is their right, it's inevitable, and there's sharing to be done. The refusal to share is what's resulting in the current resistance of the West to the rise of the first non-Caucasian civilization in 400 years, to look it in the eye. It's called Chinese. And my Indian friends quite often say, you're a bit pro-Chinese, Chandran. And I said, no, I'm just looking at the facts here. And as soon as the Indians get their act together, I said, they will be on your case too, because it's so difficult. And that's the realization. So it's not a decline, it's now sharing, but there will be a steep adjustment that needs to be made. And whether that adjustment is made by political leaders in the West who understand that, and it's difficult. Your former prime minister, I think, was a great example of someone who was unable to understand that the world had changed and his privileges will not exist for a long time. We'll see how the new guy does, but it's innate in this belief we are special. But of course it is innate in people who are settlers, because with settlement came the sort of conviction that we are better than these local people. We would take away from them and we would justify our ability to take away because they are inferior. And so I think that adjustment will be painful, but it is happening. And I think the thing that I talk about in my first book on consumption, etc., that we have to discuss this with in ways that Asia doesn't emulate because of the other issues, which is essentially the peaking of the global population. And the idea that Asians will emulate Western political and economic systems is catastrophic, because that very system is built on exceptionalism and the unfettered freedoms of the individual.
Just to follow on. Yes, thanks, Chandran. Just to follow up on what you've been saying, the subtitle of the book refers to a post-Western world.
Yeah.
What do you envisage by that notion of a post-Western world? What might it look like?
Well, a post-Western world will look like where 85% of the world will actually have a say in the way the world is run. A small group of countries will not refer to wars that they create and essentially sanctions they impose, and refer to it as the international community. A post-Western world will look like one in which that the monetary systems and the reserve currencies is not one that is used as a weapon against anyone who's the enemy of the West. A post-Western world will look like one in which the rules are not simply set by the West. Or come to the business world, which I live in. A post-Western world will not look like one in which the 5-6 of the largest investment banks in the world are all run by white men or women. A post-Western world will look like one in where the rating agencies are all not run by Western people. The auditing firms, the accounting firms, the big four are not all Western. Why can't we have 20? The Japanese and Indians and Chinese do maths too. They can be trusted. They can do audits. So that's what a post-Western world will look like. And there'll be no more reference to a rules-based order, which excludes the majority of the world who did not partake in making those rules. So there's a whole host of things that I talk about. And that modernity is not shaped through the lens of Western experience only, but it will embrace the best of both worlds. This is not to say that the Western ideals and great achievements of the West and traditions should be ignored, but it will be a more equitable world in which not everyone is indoctrinated to believe that if they ape the West and Western ways, then they'll be accepted in societies. So that's what I mean by a post-Western world. And the world goes through a whole host of things with regard to what the post-Western world looks like. I mean, I don't want to talk about the emotional subject of the Ukraine war, but therein lies some of the kernels of what I'm talking about.
Chandran, just to flesh that out one little bit more, one can see that a post-Western world would be one in which the market will have a more equitable distribution of those participating and benefiting from it, and on the political scene likewise. Now, the non-West, what do you think it will bring to the table, other than the fact that it'll have a higher share of decision-making on various fronts, economic, political, and so on? If we say that the West has brought a certain number of ideas, of processes, of concepts, what will with the non-West or the East's contribution in the years to come? Can you visualize something along those lines?
A huge amount. All the stuff that for hundreds of years have been essentially either deliberately ignored, swept under the carpet, or not allowed to thrive. Ancient ideas and philosophies about way to live and things like that. So I think a post-Western world will look like one in which this idea, the fig leaf of democracy, will not be used in the same way it's used by the United States and its allies to essentially demonize other countries. That will have pluralistic sort of political systems and the acceptance that other political systems work and work within the different contexts. And I think a post-Western world, what the post-Western world and the non-Western world will bring to it is ideas that in this current time, let's remember too, that when the whole expansion, the colonization of the world by a handful of countries in Europe started about 500 years ago, the world's population was less than 1 billion people. And with that expansion, today we live in a world with 8 billion people, expanding to about 10 billion in the next 25 to 30 years. There are traditions in those countries that essentially are hugely relevant to the world we live in. And I will be bold enough to say that what does collective welfare look like as opposed to the individualistic, exceptionalism, narcissistic sort of approaches of modern Western societies as represented by the United States. So many of these, the Japanese way is a very different way of looking at things. The Chinese civilization is old, yet the Western world has demonized the Chinese political system, the paranoia and fear, xenophobia. So what we will see is perhaps a flourishing of different political systems, different economic systems, and of course rooted in different cultural traditions, and of course knowledge around a whole host of different things as well. So I think we need to understand too that there was an active suppression of the knowledge, the cultures, and the vitality and the economics of other countries. But more importantly, has been the suppression of different ways of organizing our societies. So I think there will be a world that we will all learn from, and it's a world too in which we should not allow non-Western powers that are large to also dominate or fill the void that's hopefully going to be there, but not replaced by non-Western actors in a negative way.
I'm going to pose one last question from me before opening it up. But before I do, could I encourage everyone who's watching and listening to Chandran to prepare some questions for him to respond to in just a minute or two, and we'll take them from both online and those who are here in person, physically present. I know that you've had a long-standing interest in matters to do with environment. How does that play out in terms of the whole question of white privilege and how things might look like in a post-Western world?
Well, thank you for that question. It's something I've thought about a lot. In fact, there's a chapter in the book about the environment, and essentially, there's two things I'd like to say. Many of the solutions that are being proposed by the Western world that leads the argument. I mean, until about a few months ago, the champion of the environmental movement apparently was some 16-year-old girl out of a rich country in Europe, which has about 5 people living in it. And that was the desire for essentially iconic white savior. And what better than a 16-year-old girl? You got the gender issue in there, you got the white woman, the whiteness in there, and you got a youth. I mean, brilliant, And you think that there's no young person in Africa, China, India, Indonesia, Latin America who cares about anything. So that's one of the capture. But more importantly, in the economic front is how the solutions are being framed as well. So the spokespeople on everything to do with sustainability and environment are essentially Westerners. I bet none of you could mention a leading thought leader on the environment who's Chinese, African, or Latin American. We all know most of them are Westerners. And that essentially is a lie and a distortion of it. So why that lie and distortion? Because the narrative essentially needs to fit in with a future in which the Western world does not have to accommodate the major adjustments it needs to make to essentially talk about parity in terms of how we discuss the future. And Australia has been at the heart of that debate in terms of its negligence and its inability to take responsibility. So I would argue that the way that looks like, particularly at the moment, is in terms of many of the market-led solutions. Many of these market-led solutions are essentially led by Western thought leaders, Western institutions, and the active players in those markets will be the same financial institutions led by the West. And more importantly, it doesn't require them to make the moral adjustments that they need to make in relation to the changes in lifestyles and essentially also in terms of the economic models. And this makes it very difficult. So if you're interested, anyone's interested, I wrote a piece about 6 months ago, arguing basically, I come from a bit of a science technical background, that anyone who knows anything about the science will know that net zero is a myth. Net zero is a lie. There is no such thing as a net zero carbon world. Yet this has become the mantra. Why? Because it's very convenient for Western governments to project this idea of net zero. And a major part of the net zero strategy is, of course, offsets in the developing world. Like apparently we'll all continue to grow trees while they all continue to essentially business as usual, and somehow there'll be a net zero future. The logic is that scientifically, if from a science point of view, it's illogical. From an economics point of view, it doesn't make any sense. So my point about the environment is much of the solutions refuse to accept, and that's the final point I would make, that in the world today of 8 billion, 5 billion people are essentially in the periphery of what is the economic model that is dominated by essentially Western powers, to which many of the developing countries, unfortunately, in my view, are seeking to enter and copy. But the reality is that just taking the Asia region, I don't use politically incorrect words like the Indo-Pacific, coined by conservative Americans. The Asia-Pacific region, or Asia, has a population of about 4.5 billion, peaking at 6 billion. The idea that in 2050, 6 billion Asians should aspire to live like Americans and Europeans or Australians is a lie. So we'll have to do things very, very differently. And that requires us to essentially rethink the way we organize our societies. The way we organize our societies cannot be around the neoliberal fantasies that have been essentially promoted by small liberal democracies. It cannot be. We will have to essentially fashion rules that put collective welfare above individual rights. The idea that you put collective welfare above individual rights is anathema to the Western liberal tradition. But that Western liberal tradition does not sit comfortably now with the future that we will have to essentially embark on. And that political discussion needs to take place in the developing world, the large ones. So I'll make that final point by saying today, if you look at the larger countries, India and China, 2 in Asia, looking like me, if you're poor today, would you rather be Chinese or Indian? The idea is very simple. One political system will be able to navigate a very complex, tortured 21st century that puts people's rights in terms of their ability to what I call the basic rights of life before a political system, ideological political system that is enshrined in some notion that everyone can be free and do everything they want to do. So the answer to that question is, if you're poor today, you'd rather be Chinese than Indian, because at least you have a better way in terms of the state's ability to get organized and essentially deal with the existential threats of our time.
Okay. Now, has someone been monitoring questions from you have? Okay. Are there some?
There's quite a number of questions online, but
We'll start online because here in person they've dominated on previous occasions. Yes.
Christian, to call them out.
Yes, from here, please.
Right, where shall I start? Okay. One question that came up early on as Chandran was speaking was how would, so when asked, let me provide the backdrop to the question, when asked what would the post-Western world look like, one answer given was it would not be a world it would be a world where 85% of people might have a say in how it was run. And the question that then came was, how would that population have a say? What would prevent us getting having a repetition of the sorts of systemic practices that which exclude large numbers of people from having a say? So that's one question I'll put.
Yes. Is there another question?
There
Maybe
is.
we can take a couple.
Yes. I'll pick something quite different. How would a post-Western world relate or reflect a potential post-patriarchal future world? I'll leave it. I think that's more than enough.
Well, two aspects of what a post-Western world might look like.
Yeah.
Chandran, would you like to have a go at one or both of those?
Well, perhaps the first one, in terms of how would we prevent? Well, the first thing is you need to get over the struggle of essentially, from the point of view, the 85% of being dictated to. So if you get over that, that will essentially necessitate the building of new institutions. So you would not have a G7 dominated by, or G8 dominated by 7 white guys and women, and then 1 Japanese. You would not have that. You would not have a little island called the United Kingdom, essentially having a disproportionate say in global affairs. And I say respectfully, also a place called Australia with about 22 million people, just because it's seen as an Anglo-Saxon, essentially nation. Right, so she would completely rethink the world. It would also be a world in which powers like China would not be demonized, wouldn't have a say representatively. So that includes the United Nations. But apart from the institutional changes, which will be difficult, because if you take the Security Council, etc., it was formed essentially by the victors of the Second World War, and they want to maintain that. India is not in there. No African nation is in there. So those things will change, those things will come, they are inevitable. But more importantly is also a world in which the telling of history, the teaching of culture, etc., and this is why one of the reasons I wrote the book, will move from a point that young Asians will not think that everything Western is better. And that is something that most white people do not understand. That I was brought up in a world where I was said anything that looks like me is second class. But if they came from Adelaide or Darwin or came from the United States, it must be better. But if I listened to the Beatles, that was better than listening to classical traditional Indian music. That was inferior. So it will be a world in which essentially appreciation of things is also more balanced, and people see the value in things that are essentially more diverse, and therefore building their confidence so that they are not subservient. So the subservience moves away, which is something that is not well understood. I mean, just to give you an example, a post-Western world will be one in which, when a 79-year-old man who's called the President of the United States travels to Asia, as he did last year, and incites tension and wars, we in this part of the world will not tolerate it. And we will not accept it. And the world will be one in which there will be publications that will denounce such warmongering, rather than call someone like that the leader of the free world. Secondly, the leaders of 2 very ancient and proud nations, Korea and Japan, will not behave like fawning kids meeting the white chief. And that's what I saw on TV. So it's a very different way of looking at the world. And that's really what we mean. So it's both mindsets, the capture of the mind, that needs to be tweaked. A lot of young Asians believe the better life is to be had in Australia, somewhere in the UK or somewhere else. They've all been captured. They don't feel that they should stay here. So that's the ideological battle. And then there's the institutional one. So that's a kind of quick response to that point. I think the second question was something to do, does the post-Western world tie together with essentially a post-patriarchal world? I think that was the question, am I right?
Yes.
Yes. And I think that's an important one. And this is something that I deliberately did not go into the book, particularly sexual politics. But since I've been asked the question, I think a post-Western world will be one in which sexual politics is not defined through the lens of the Western feminist movement only. That the Western feminist movement will not believe that they speak for the rest of all of us, including women in the non-Western world. And that will be also a changing of the narrative. And that is a difficult one for many to understand. And I've been asked quite sometimes that, yeah, we fully understand, and the most important thing is, we need to have equal rights. And then because I'm a male, I'm seen to, Western women want to put me sort of, above them in the hierarchy of things. So in a crude way, I say to the Western feminist movement, which I've embraced and I have supported, but it has essentially become also a tool to essentially suggest that Western systems know what is best for women around the world. And apparently equality for women is apparently something to do with being a member of the board of a company. I go to many conferences where, Western women and now Asian women and African women think that women's rights are a good metrics as silly things like the amount of women on boards of companies. Why would women want to go and do the silly jobs that men have done in crap companies? So I think this is a very shallow definition. So the post-Western world's post-patriarchal future will be one in which the narrative about women's rights is not dominated by Western women and their view of essentially gender equality as well. So I see that as very important. One thing I will say is it's been very interesting to me that since I've written this book, that I've had very good Western friends who said to me, this is hard. Why have you done this? Almost as if they thought me as part of the tribe, someone who has been westernized, someone who knows the game. And now I've apparently let the secrets out, fearful that I have said something that should not be said. And then of course I've got the other part, which is the cancel. Don't review the book, don't have him. So I'm very grateful that you've all invited me, and I hope I'm not offending anyone. But what I thought so interesting is that 15% of the world can be so powerful and say, you should not be doing this. That is the power that they have. So at the same time, I would like to therefore think they would see, but they're the same 15%, men and women in the Western world, who are resisting part of my discourse. But at the same time, they are saying to me that women's rights are important. Well, 85% of the women population of the world are non-Western people who essentially sit below the pile of the Western civilizations that dominate the world. So and I come from a family where I have 4 sisters, and my mother was the leader of the family, etc. I understand the issues, but I'm very interested in this refusal to accept that on one hand, we need to change a world in which 15% of the world dominate the rules. But on the other hand, that same 15% is very sort of emboldened to say we need to have parity between the sexes too. Of course, we need parity between the sexes, but 85% of the world needs freedom from the clutches of essentially white privilege too.
Okay, let's see, who wants to ask questions here? I've got one hand, anybody? So we get 2 going. I can't see. John and Casey. Casey and John, okay? Casey, yes. Quick questions, we'll get more answers.
Salam bahagia, Saudara Chandran.
Selamat petang, Bang.
Nama saya Casey, asal dari Ipoh.
Dari Malaysia. Oke,
Yeah.
balik rumah.
Dari Melbourne sekarang.
Oke.
I'm sorry. Thank you for your very interesting presentation. provocative, challenging. First, Joe, I have, with your forbearance and those of my friends, brothers and sisters in this room, I do need a bit of time for some background in the context.
Quick background.
Okay.
Quick.
I just want to, for the benefit of Chandran, to say that I've been schooled in the time of Edward Said, Gorbachev, Huntington, Fukuyama, Richard Rorty, Amartya Sen, and Amitai Etzioni. And the reason why I felt that, well, these were all learnings from Australia, not in Malaysia. And I have been in Melbourne for 32 years. In that time, I have written much the same as you have, but not have been, of course, as successful and as not acknowledged. I have been writing weekly columns, essentially to better relations between Australia and Malaysia. The question I have, well, essentially, I agree with practically all that you have written in your book. The question that I have is, in the time that you have, well, since you've written that book, and with the reaction, have you ever wondered that if you had been less provocative in presenting them in terms of black and white, whether you might have been able to reach people in ways that they may not feel so antagonized?
That's a question.
Yeah.
That's a question. Fair enough.
Thank you.
Thanks, Casey. Thank you. It's a very interesting question. John, you asked your question as well, and we'll have two questions.
Okay, thanks.
Chandran, thank you. I guess my question is whether the problem is with much of the rules-based order that's already there, or whether it's a problem of powerful groups breaching them. For example, and also maybe what key documents or rules you think should be the basis of a new order if you're reshaping it. Just without a lot of depth, but intuitively I would have thought that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was passed by the United Nations as a whole, includes civil and political rights, but also social, economic and cultural rights. So individual and community aspects in that, or important documents like the rights of workers and migrants, for example, or refugees, should apply to everybody, and that it could be a protection against Amazon trying to union bust in the United States, or the Chinese government preventing the organisation of free trade unions in Hong Kong or mainland China. So I'm just wondering, I can see why the World Trade Organization or others, probably the rules are balanced to, in the favour of the rich, and you need to reform it. But do you see any key documents that are not too bad already, or that should be changed as the basis for what you'd like to see a wider voice heard?
Thank you. Thank you so much. So to the first question about, I've been asked this before, should I have been less provocative, etc.? Actually, I didn't seek to be provocative at all. But I do remember 25 years ago when I started talking about climate change and essentially biodiversity loss, before most people even thought about these things, I was asked the same question. My God, you're a bit too hardcore. It's all going to be all right. because, human ingenuity and human beings are aware. Well, we know that essentially that didn't happen. So 25 years ago too, I was asked to be, that I was being provocative. So I say often that I don't seek to be provocative, but in an era of intellectual dishonesty, I believe we live in a time where intellectual dishonesty is the currency of our times. Call it, being less provocative. So most of us have handcuffs. One of the things that I try and exercise is the fact that I don't have handcuffs. I don't work for somebody else, and I don't have to worry about whether they like it or not. Of course, I seek to be polite. I don't seek to be rude, but I say it as it is. So in an era of great intellectual dishonesty, which has permeated academia, business, politics, and the public sphere, I have made it part of the Global Institute's sort of mandate is to speak clearly because we have no handcuffs. I don't take money from anyone, yet I'm not the Harvard Business School guy. I'm not the MIT guy looking for a retainer or the McKinsey guys. So that makes it things. But the other point to that question, which I think, Professor, you said is very interesting, is, but let's assume what I was saying comes across as rather blunt and harsh. Blunt and harsh to whom? The 15%? But I'm also speaking to the 85%. So therein lies, in fact, in our subconscious, that I should write a book to appeal to those who already have such privileges, that I should assuage them with sort of niceties. I don't think I'm being rude. So, but really the book is for everyone. And the everyone on the planet is made up of 15% of people that I'm addressing as essentially people who are part of the white privilege, and that's 85% of the rest of us. And I want them to think about things too. So the book is actually not written to be provocative. It was essentially to be factual, truthful, and engage. But if it does upset a few people, then that is for them to consider. That is not my intention. My intention is to put it out, put an argument, and for brighter minds to take it forward. So yeah, so I'm not worried that right-wing, racist, etc. I've been called a racist too, which I find very interesting actually. And to the earlier question to my brother from Malaysia, those of you who are interested, I'm essentially fighting very, very publicly the institutional racism of the supremacist Malay-led government in Malaysia. So it's not like I'm just calling out racism of, in my own country, the institutional racism of the Malay elites is akin to the white supremacists in Australia, in the United States. So I sought to answer these questions in that way. So the second question, I do agree we need rules, and we have all these declarations. But as you will know, it's the interpretation of these declarations and how they are looked at that becomes very important. And most importantly is the narrative and the power to essentially demonize and punish. When the United States goes into Afghanistan and is responsible after 20 years for the death of 170,000 people, none of us have the ability to talk about human rights violations, war crimes, or the ability to sanction the United States and its allies, including Australia. None of us. And that's why we are talking about essentially who has the power, what are the checks and balances, how do we even define this term, human rights? Whilst I'm never going to argue against what we call universal rights, but the interpretation of that is very different. If you're a Black person in the United States, or if you're a First Nation person in Australia, your human rights have been violated and they can do nothing about it.
Okay, we could take one final question. Anyone keen to ask one final question? Yes.
I'm Susan. Thanks for that great presentation, Chandran. Just got a question about where you see future ties as the East rises. Will you see connections in alliances between East and West as a new way of thinking? Or do you think that it's more of Eastern alliances before those happen? And why?
Thank you, Susan. In fact, I've just finished submitting an article this week, which should be published hopefully over the weekend, where I talk about essentially new alliances. And I was using the Biden trip last week as essentially an example of what an archaic, counterproductive, old world view of the world. A divisive, essentially divide and rule. And unfortunately, the Australians become part and parcel of this. Most of us in Asia look at this and say, here we go again, same old thing. So I do see a very important opportunity for the world to change, but it does require the recognition of a couple of things, and the article spells it out. The United States of America is a military industrial complex, is an existential threat to the world. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is one of the largest industries in the world. This is an industry that essentially, it's a bit like if you sell ice creams, you need hot days in Melbourne. True? If you sell weapons of death, you need war. And that's what the United States industrial military complex is. And we need to understand this. Therefore, I call for, like we call for the decarbonization of the world, I call for a demilitarization of the American industrial military complex. This is not conspiracies. It is so complex that is essentially captured politicians, TV anchors, tech companies, financial institutions. Why is it that when you watch CNN, it seems like a sort of, real world war theater kind of movie? Why do they all support wars? Why? Because as long as wars are essentially led and fueled by the West, it's okay. And the Ukraine war is an interesting one. And I wrote a piece about it for those of you who are interested. So I think there is a real point to what you're saying. We need alliances, but we can only have those new alliances. I've always argued that Europe and Asia, two ancient civilizations, have much in common that we have with the Australians and their moles, than the Americans and their moles. Yet, because of the power of the Americans to punish everyone, if you're not on my side, everyone has become subservient. And that power resides in its financial institutions and its military industrial complex. And I argue in Asia that we need to demilitarize and basically confront the military industrial complex and form alliances. And the breakthrough will come. Imagine this. When China, Japan, and Korea signed a security pact with zero involvement of the Yanks. Yet, in this part of the world, we're still thinking that we need John Wayne and Joe Biden to essentially secure our security. And it's an oxymoron. You don't ask ExxonMobil to decarbonize the world, or Shell. You don't go to the most militaristic nation on the human history, which has essentially been at war for 95% of its history, which has been losing wars since 1975. But winning wars is no more the objective of the American military complex. It is just wars, babe. Just let's have a war. And that fuels it all. So to your point, Susan, we do need it. We need Australia to essentially decouple from the Anglo-Saxon military alliance of the United States and the UK, and essentially form new alliances with Indonesia, with China. How on earth can China be a threat to Australia? Who on earth put that in your minds?
Thank you. Thank you, Chandran. Thank you so much.
I'm happy to take another question, if people are interested.
Yes, I'm sure they're very interested, but we're running to a very tight schedule, Chandran. But I've had a request from one of our participants. I'm sure it reflects many others. You've mentioned two articles, a recent one and a forthcoming one. If you could let us know where they're published, and we could then circulate the link.
I will send them to you. And I also wrote another one about the Quad and the alliance that Australia has formed with the United States. You need to change this. You're on the wrong side of history if you go down that route. But let's
Well
hope.
done,
I will send it all to you
Chandran.
in peace. And I'm on your side, by the way. Okay, so I'm not the enemy. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
I knew that we would get a no holds barred presentation, and that's what we got. And we're very grateful and indebted to you for making that presentation. And we'll keep in touch in the months ahead.
Thank you.
All the best.
Thank you.
Speak from here. All right. Well, now we're just about ready for a break. I just want to make two, while people still have focus, two things. The first is I want to put this to our participants online, and specifically those who are living in Melbourne. We would very much like to see some of you face to face, if that is possible. Of course, if you live miles and miles away from where the venue is for this series, that might be difficult. But if it is possible, we'd love to see you next week, which will be the final session. And the University College has even promised us at their expense more food, and there will be wine and champagne. And we would love to celebrate the way forward with as many of you who are online as are able to join us next Tuesday at no extra cost to anyone. So if you can do that, that would be wonderful. And the second thing I'd like to request each and every one, because we are going to try and make next week a little bit special, is to see whether we can, at least for that session, bring a few additional people to join us and share with us their perspectives, as well as listen to what's on offer. So if everyone, participants here physically present and online, are able to encourage one or more of their friends to join you, that would be excellent. It would be another, if you like, test of your persuasive skills as you approach people far and wide. They can join us online from anywhere in the world. And we do have some people as far away as London joining us. So we can add a couple more if you know people in different parts of Asia or Europe. I beg your pardon? No, there's no added cost to anyone. So the invitation is there, and I'll remind you in the next day or so when I send an update to everyone who's registered. Now it's time for a break, about 10 to 12 minutes, cup of tea, both for those of us who are online who've been concentrating, but also for those who are here. And then we're going to have a very, very interesting panel discussion involving 4 of the participants in response to what we've been hearing from Chandran. It'll be very interesting to hear their perspective. So I hope you will all be attentive to what they have to tell us. Okay. All right, if people could sit down and the panelists come to the front, please.
Hi, Lee. Nice to meet you. Or your email address. Now you're real.
Here we go.
Oh, so I can pick myself so anyway. Nice to meet you, Jane.
All right, friends, if we could have your attention. We're now going to have a panel, short, about 20 minutes or so, as a kind of follow-up to the presentation and conversation we've had with Chandran Nair. And Christian has agreed to facilitate the conversation. So he's on my right. For those who don't know, this is Jane Hosking, this is Lee Monick and Yana Cantaloupe. And they've all been involved in one way or another with conversation at the Crossroads. And they're going to offer us, I hope, some interesting observations. So over to you, Christian.
Okay, thanks, Joe. So as Joe said, it's my job to kind of facilitate, and I thought I just might begin rather broadly and then maybe focus on a few specific issues. So maybe I'd like to start by just asking each of the three of you your take or what you made of what Chandran Nair had to say in broad terms, and then we can get into some of the more specific issues that he raised. So what do you make of the perspectives that he shared with us just before the break? I don't know who wants to go first.
You dominate. Who goes first, Sean?
I'll start with you. Everyone gets a turn.
I had a very mixed response to the presentation because a lot of what the material covered for me was fairly old news and unremarkable. And I'm always very perplexed when I find myself in that position, especially listening to an individual who's obviously highly considered and thoughtful and influential in their field. It always puts you in or puts me at any rate in that kind of reflective mode of why are we having to say this again, or why am I having to hear this again? Why is it so obvious to me and not to others? So yeah, I think that was one of those useful repeat moments that we often have to have because a lot of the same battles have to be fought and refought. But the presentation certainly put it back on me to re-examine ways in which I can make what's obvious to me more obvious to others.
Perhaps I would like to follow up before I get to the other two, because you've opened the space to what was going to be my second question. And is society alive to these perspectives? So that follows very neatly from what you've just said. So you didn't find the perspective itself very new, but perhaps it tells us something about the receptivity to these kinds of ideas.
Well, if by alive you mean, people are willing to be persuaded by them, I would suggest that there are very distinct groups in my own network, just referring back to the tools that we've been trying to develop over this series, in my own network for whom they're perfectly aware of these ideas, but there's just seemingly so far not a chance that they will be persuaded to them. So that's opposed to people who are just ignorant.
When you say not persuaded, what do you mean? You mean they've heard this, but they're not buying it?
Yeah. Or they've heard it and they're actually outraged. I think there's two different kinds of, importantly, two different kinds of response. You can disagree with something quite respectfully, and you can hear something and just think, how dare you?
Right.
And can I ask, if you don't mind me asking, do you think that's reflective of your broader group, or perhaps the broader reflection is that very few people in society have heard this narrative? Because that's my take on it, maybe, and that's a reflection of my broader group, that this would be a confronting narrative for many people, that this would be for our broader society, be it, Australian, our close Australian network, a new confronting perspective on the global world order. That's my sense of in terms of reflecting on how my network might listen to or respond to Chandran, irrespective of my views of what he had to say, which is maybe a separate question, but just more to your point. So, what are your thoughts there? Did you think your network would have all heard this before?
Yes.
Okay. That's
yes,
really
but they would be like a lot of them would be outraged by it. Yeah. And they would still they've maintained that horror
Rage.
or shock or rage over decades of their own life. Yeah.
I don't know whether everyone has heard it before. I think it really does depend on the different circles you mix in. I feel like a lot of my current network would be familiar with these kind of views, and many would be accepting of them and supportive of views such as we heard tonight. But I'm also from a small country town in northern Victoria, and I've lived in outback Queensland. So I think that in a lot of these places, maybe there's been a little bit of, they've heard it here and there, tiny bits and pieces, but very likely not enough to really understand these kind of perspectives.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm curious, unpacking for all of us what we think those perspectives are that would either outrage or be, only have heard in the slightest sense, be confronting. And if I can just throw a few out there, it would be that these institutions are dominated within this framework of whiteness. Certain, his ideas at the end about the military industrial complex. I know that's very popular in academic circles and within certain parts of the left, but I'm not sure how pervasive or thought of that idea is beyond that. And certainly in most of the, I'd say traditional media, Western media that we follow, that's not a concept that's widely dispelled. Those are a couple of things that I would suggest would either outrage, and maybe that's a question, is that what you see it as outraging your friends? And are those the things that you see as being things they may have just heard a little bit on, but may not have reflected on? Or are there other things that Chandra said that stood out to you as being provocative?
Yeah, he did say some things were provocative. Sometimes I was sitting there thinking, "Whoa, I'm a white person. Is this being directed at me?" But I think that it's important for us to try and listen, and especially being from the white group in the room, to try and hear these different perspectives that make us feel uncomfortable sometimes. But of course, I actually agreed with a lot of what he said. Very passionately support his idea of greater equity for all people across the world and in the international system. Is something I've supported for a really long time. And also particularly looking at history. He mentioned the teaching of history and how it's not taught. It's taught from a very specific lens, through a white lens, and completely agree with that. And I think Australia is a great example of where we haven't. I don't think the majority of the population really understands what has happened in this land and what happened to the First Nations people. I don't think I understood from the education I had growing up. It wasn't until I took a genocide subject in university, and Australia was one of the case studies, that I thought, what, genocide, Australia? And then, that was part of my education and awareness. But I don't think the majority of the population is aware of these kind of things. And it's not just the history, but then what continues to happen today and the systemic racism we have in this country. I think most Australians are not aware. Even those of us who are aware, maybe we're not fully educated. We need to educate ourselves about what the way things are.
I want to, do you want to give your response to what you made of it though, Lee? Because so what you've done is you've said what your network, to use Joe's phrase, how they might have responded.
I'm not sure if I could give a total response in terms of what I made of it on whole, because there's a lot there I want to go back and reflect on. But maybe one thing that did come into mind in terms of what I was being challenged by is what are the limits perhaps of this framework of whiteness in terms of critiquing the global world order. And
That was what I was going to ask.
and I suppose on that front, thinking about whether or not you know, we need to be really challenging a logic of late capitalism rather than, or maybe supplementing the critique of whiteness, which I think has relevance. You know, I think it certainly has relevance in terms of colonial studies, in terms of understanding, you know, as we've discussed in previous weeks, the privilege that you have, that privilege being born of historical injustices, and that you need to give up something of what you have to right those wrongs. And I like reflecting on that, not just at a national level, when we talk about Indigenous Australians, but reflecting on that at a global level. And certainly colonial studies, post-colonial studies is a really powerful lens through which to think about those things. But I was reflecting on the limits of whiteness as a construct, and you know, whether or not, and I know Chandran wasn't advocating for this, you know, if we is the superficial outcome here that we replace Western billionaires with non-Western billionaires, that we simply start creating these institutions that co-opt poor people for the gains of the wealthy, irrespective of the color of their skin or the country they're born in. So I'm interested in teasing that out, whilst saying that I think whiteness is a really powerful lens within which to critique the global world order, and there's a lot of merit to what he had to say.
Sure. It was very, so here's something I'd like to throw into that, because when he was asked what would a post-Western world order look like, I don't know if anyone else in the room noticed, it was all phrased in the negative. It is not this kind of world. So it's not where, you know, white men sit on all the major boards, but there was no question at that point that there would be boards, right? So then he later talked about dismantling institutions.
That's right.
So there was another layer to that didn't come out the first time round, which was a negation of Western. Now this made me think, and it's a word and term we've used a lot, and I wonder, not that I'm opposed to its use, the word Western, is a very homogenizing term, right? I'm not Joe Biden, but I'm a Westerner, clearly and obviously. I wonder if this is part of the reaction. Now, I'm not suggesting that we aren't all Western, but there's a lot in the West, right? So for instance, in the sum up, Latin Americans were excluded from being Western, but having Colombian friends, I can tell you they think of themselves as Western. Do you regard Russia as Western? It's obviously pitted against the West, but in other measures, it's seen as very much instantiating some kinds of Western values. So my question is not, do we need to do without the West and the rest, but is this a barrier to getting people to think more about these kinds of issues? So that's an open question to everyone here.
I actually think it's in Australia's good fortunes that we're not quite as homogenous, even though like that the West is much less homogenous than it might be considered when we just have these conversations where we use that phrase as a shorthand. It's almost as if we've got less distance to travel in order to offer redress or reparation or to transform ourselves, because we're not quite the militaristic machine.
Right.
That some of us anyway, some of our leaders have tried to aspire to or to claim to emulate. I mean, it's just cute, really. I mean, we're at the bottom end of the world and there's so few of us, we can't possibly compete on that scale if that's what the West scale actually is. And also, you know, we have our own recent history of ticking off a great many Western countries. We've disappointed New Zealand on countless occasions and continue when we deport their citizens for having criminal records. We really annoyed France on the submarine deal. And you could come up with any number of occasions where we don't seem to be too discriminating.
So this is what I'm sort of getting at. The West involves the US military industrial complex, but also the feminist movement, which he called out as a very Western movement. So there's a lot going on as the West is a sort of a veritable Proteus. right? So I'm wondering if unpacking some of that would be helpful, not so much for the sake of an ivory tower academic argument, but when talking to friends that are perhaps not so persuaded. Because it might make them feel that what you're doing is putting them all in the same basket. There are shades of grey. Not to belittle colonialise that, all of the things that were discussed. I'm just thinking strategically about what might be some answers, and perhaps I'm barking up the wrong tree, but what might be some answers to how we would inject these sorts of issues into conversations where the people we're talking with are a little resistant, either through ignorance or through affrontedness.
Yeah, but I think it's language that people can understand, West, East. And I do think it's going to bring a lot more nuance to a discussion if you bring in all the different elements. But then there's the downside that maybe people will get lost in the complexity, especially if they're not familiar with the topic. So I get it that you've kind of got the good side and the bad side of taking a different approach.
Yeah, I think there's some value in the frame of Westernness and non-Westernness. I think it is a really useful frame for bringing people into the conversation. I think whiteness is far more challenging.
Right.
And he was traversing that bounds between Western, non-Western, whiteness, non-whiteness. I think whiteness is more challenging, more complex as a concept. I know in terms of the people in my network who might get there, back up, you say things like white privilege or white supremacy and immediately tense up. Whereas I think concepts of Western, non-West are perhaps a little bit more accessible. And I think they actually have a lot of value, to some of the things I thought more positively on in terms of what Chandran was saying.
I think it depends on who you're engaging with.
That's also true.
As to what kind of language you should use. Like, I think it's good to confront people sometimes by using these words. Whiteness, white supremacy and all of that. But I don't think that you're going to get anywhere with someone if you try to provoke them or try to point out that they're wrong. I believe strongly, and I think it comes from where I'm from, being a left-winger who grew up in a very conservative town. I believe in bringing people with me and bringing people with us in sharing our views, and instead of trying to argue them down, even if, I believe in standing up against what's wrong, calling out racism wherever you see it. But I also believe in doing it in a way that's actually going to reach the other person. And I don't think that arguing them down or putting them in their place or making them feel stupid is an effective way of having that kind of conversation. I've got a redneck uncle, and I've had many positive engagements with him, and he was actually quite receptive to that. So I could have taken a different route and tried to tell him he was wrong. I did try to tell him he was wrong, but in a polite way, and I think that was effective. Yeah.
No, I mean, the only reflection there is that my comments about the difference between whiteness and Western, non-Western discourse is that whilst I think whiteness is challenging, I certainly would agree with you that just because it's challenging doesn't mean we don't live up to that challenge of finding a way to have that conversation. I have many racist South African farmers in my family who, would be challenged by these things, but that doesn't mean the conversation is not important to have.
So final question, I know we don't have long. How confident would you be that in a post-Western world of the sort that Chandran described, albeit briefly, that 85% of the population would have a say in in the matters that affected their lives?
Well, I think one thing I would have liked to have heard more from Chandran on is the nation state and the role of the nation state in a post-Western world. And I think that would be the most obvious vehicle to explore for enfranchising people. And how and why and when people do get a say. I mean, is it just, we were having this conversation earlier in the night at the table I'm seated at, do we raise the bar for what counts as minimum participation in democracy? by expecting people to be dialogical citizens, as opposed to, say, citizens who pay their taxes and vote once every 3 years. And I think that overlaps with this question of, well, what minimum expectations do we hold of a nation state to facilitate that and make that possible for people to feel like citizenship is something they can realistically pursue, even if it's only 1 hour a week.
Either of you two have a thought on that last question?
I suppose my reflection maybe harks on something I said earlier, that, you know, my reflection is that a post-Western world can only benefit the 80% if we are confronting the excesses of capitalism and the institutions that, you know, instantiate those excesses at a global level. Because otherwise you might enfranchise 80% of the countries who aren't enfranchised, but not the people in those countries. So I certainly think the goal is important, and I don't think it's a simplification to articulate it in that way. And I don't think Chandran is so simple in his thesis that he would suggest, because again, I reflected like you on what he said in the beginning, and then at the end, he provided some more color to it, that it's not about simply giving people a seat at the table. I think he was very clear about that. I think it was very much about what that table looks like. And I know in other instances I've heard him speak, and, you know, he speaks about a new Asian modernity in terms of how people identify themselves within this global order, that it's not simply a aspirational view of being a Westerner. Those are my reflections on that.
Joe, I think we might be out of time. Yeah, we've got lots more to still get through. So perhaps we should thank the three of you for putting yourselves on the spot.
There's dialogical citizenship at work. Okay. We should have more of that on our media and part of our educational infrastructure. That, by the way, was the final slide or two that I'm not going to go through, and the role of education in progressing the idea of a new kind of civic engagement. What I want to do now is take that a step further, and that is to talk about a certain kind of dialogue, which I think is urgently needed, and which, for better or for worse, Chandran did not refer to and is not part of his book. That's not to be held against him, but I think it's a very important missing dimension. And that is the role of society, and in particular, the role of culture. And when one says that, that means the role of civilizations. I think what Chandran was referring to, although he didn't necessarily use this language, was not so much the West as the dominant West. And there are many in the West who are not dominant, anything but dominant. He would then, had he been pushed and pushed, he would say, and I think we have to take it into account, those who are not dominant have to account as to what they're doing to put an end to that kind of dominance. And that's where the question of complicity comes in by default. You may not be sitting on these boards, but you may not be doing much about to change their structure and their way of working or their composition. Okay, now, civilizations. Another word for it is intercultural or intercivilizational dialogue. Now, this is not a new idea. The dialogue of cultures, the dialogue of civilizations, the dialogue of religious and ethical traditions. It's not a new idea. It's been around a long time. It flourished in an extraordinary way at the time when Islam was dominant in Spain. But it has not seen very bright days in a few of the centuries that followed. However, in the post-World War II period, there have been moves in that direction. One of the key UN agencies, from which the United States has withdrawn from once or twice, is of course UNESCO. And UNESCO's whole rationale for its existence is the interaction, the communication between different cultures and civilizations. The end of the Cold War saw a major UNESCO initiative called Global Agenda for Dialogue Among Civilizations, but the big push, it happened in a way that was somewhat manipulative, but nevertheless, post-September 11, with the rise of radical Islam, there was an attempt by many to try and get something like a dialogue going between important voices in Islam and important voices in the West. And that led to the UN initiative, which still goes, UN Alliance of Civilizations. Unfortunately, it has fallen a little bit by the wayside because its two initial promoters, two governments, Turkey and Spain, the Spanish and Turkish government, largely appropriated it for their own political purposes, and it has lacked the kind of drive which they gave to it some 10 to 15 years ago. But nevertheless, it has helped to put it on the table, the UN Alliance of Civilizations. So first of all, I want to look at the philosophy of this and then the method and see whether that holds some applications. Of course, it's of great significance, importance to any society that has a substantial multicultural fabric to it, including, of course, Australia. The beginning of it is to say that no cultural, religious, or ethical tradition has a monopoly on truth or wisdom. None. Despite some claims on the part of some. No tradition, no civilization has a monopoly on truth or wisdom. And yet, all of the world's major ethical traditions share something in common. If you look at the depth of those who have contributed to the wisdom of those traditions, they all agree on the dignity of human life, on the importance of personal fulfillment, and that there is such a thing as rightness in human conduct and standards for rightness of human conduct. They may interpret rightness differently, but the principle of rightness is very strong in all of them. There are differences, of course. Each major tradition has its own ethos, its own symbols, languages, customs, ethical perspectives, different approaches to personal and social relationships. Each makes a different contribution to the human dialogue. That's what makes inter-civilizational dialogue such a rich process, because it's like a feast or a banquet, and each of them brings something to the table, right? A gift, which the rest can only value and be deeply enriched by. Each understands the richness that the other one has to offer. Next one. Of course, there are also substantial differences within cultures and within civilizations. They are not homogeneous. There's no such thing as a pure culture or a pure civilization. And for many reasons, including the fact that all cultures and all civilizations have been subject to very profound cross-cultural flows throughout their history. That is true of Cynic civilization. It is true of Western Judeo-Christian tradition and civilization, and so on. Trade, war, migration, and major intellectual, scientific, and cultural artistic currents have greatly contributed to this intermingling and therefore the creation of difference even within. The point is that each civilization is a living entity. It can change and diversify over time. So there is diversity, but as we've said before, in dialogue, diversity, difference is no cause for alarm. It is part of the human inheritance. I would go further and make the claim that all human beings share the same civilizational inheritance. The same, whether you're Chinese, Australian, French, or Zimbabwean. The same. What do I mean by that? They all gain something from what the others have produced, provided, offered over centuries. And that's the logic behind the museum, the gallery, and the concert hall. Why do they do it? Because they're all premised on the proposition that we share the one civilizational inheritance. It's all part of us, and we want to be knowledgeable about the parts that make up the whole. But it's not merely to recognize diversity. It is to engage, as we've been saying, together with the other in a search for truth and better understanding. Respectful communication, speaking, but also listening metaphorically, not just words, through art, through sport, through many other areas of human endeavor. Now, dialogue can be painful. And at the intercivilizational level, it can be, and at times should be, very painful. And you need to put up with the pain. That is to say, you have to hold up your own tradition up to critical examination. If your own tradition and civilization in practice fails to live up to its noblest aspirations, well, all those who partake of that tradition bear some responsibility. So it is very important in dialogue for the participants in the dialogue to rediscover what is most profound, rich, and ethical in their tradition, and to use those as the standards by which they judge and estimate their own tradition. Not easy to do. And you can imagine what that means. If you are, let's say, someone from the Christian or secular West, and you are in dialogue with representatives of the Muslim tradition, if you have to, concede the extraordinary ravage, humiliation, and oppression that has been imposed on Muslims for centuries. And similarly, the Muslim may need also to acknowledge ways in which Islam, in practice, has not always operated in ways that are faithful to its own standards. So, profound soul searching. In other words, in dialogue, we don't just discover more about the other, we discover much more about oneself. It is self-discovery as well as other discovery. So profound soul searching within and between cultures, civilizations, traditions. It's important, therefore, and this is true of the indigenous, non-indigenous relationship, for the European settlers and their descendants to listen to the pain of the other, to acknowledge past wrongs, and to accept collective responsibility for righting the wrongs of the past, collective responsibility. You may not have been directly involved in what happened 200, 300, 400 years ago, but you must be involved in correcting the wrong of the past now. Otherwise, you become an accomplice. And therefore, dialogical method has to be nurtured by empathy and compassion. Empathy and compassion in relation to the suffering and the pain of the other. In an ideal world, their pain, the pain of the other, becomes your pain. When indigenous people suffer, you suffer. You are just with them. Of course, in practice, very hard to do. Now, one of the most important exponents of the dialogue of civilizations is one of the intellectual giants of our time. And he provides a bridge. As you will see in this little video clip or little excerpts from it, he bridges at least two major traditions. The man is called Tu Wei Ming, and I'll say a little more about him. He is now regarded, I certainly regard him, as the greatest Neo-Confucian thinker of the last 200 years. And he held the chair of East Asian Studies as a distinguished professor for 30 years at Harvard. But I'll tell you a bit more about that, but let's hear from him. I deliberately, there are so many lectures, interviews he's given over the last 40 years or more, and they are deep, very deep. So I didn't want to inflict too much, so I've chosen a kind of interview he did, which speaks a little bit more in lay language. We'll see.
Ironically, it was in the West that Du Wei Ming rediscovered the tradition of the East. Now his own ideas have excited vigorous discussion back in the world of his birth. His family was living in Kunming, China, when Du was born in 1940. When the communists came to power, the family escaped to Taiwan. At 22, Du came to the United States to study at Harvard, becoming in time a scholar of Chinese intellectual history, the author of 5 books on Confucian humanism, and an active voice in the dialogue on comparative religion. He is now a professor of Chinese history and philosophy at Harvard. Several times in the 1980s, he returned both to mainland China and Taiwan to lecture and listen. Before his departure for a year at the University of Hawaii's East-West Center, we talked at the Asia Society in New York City.
Excerpt number 2.
Now, two very powerful forces emerge in the 20th century. On the one hand, we become interdependent. The global village is emerging. So a kind of global consciousness is considered absolutely crucial for anyone, any intelligent person to look at the world. Ecological issues, nuclear annihilation, environmental issues. This all dictate the importance of global consciousness. But at the same time, in the last 10 or 15 years, the emergence of a powerful search for roots, ethnicity, land, language, so the mother tongue, the fatherland, gender, and of course, religion is part of it. And I think we need to understand the interplay between these two, on the surface, contradictory processes. The quest for interdependency and global consciousness on the one hand, and at the same time, this profound need for searching for one's own roots.
To belong to that which is like us, that where we are welcome.
Right. The tradition that I'm particularly aware of, the Confucian tradition, assumes that each and every human being is embedded, in other words, fated to be a particular human being in terms of ethnicity, gender, the birth, the place you're born, and your own socialization, and so forth. I think the fascinating lesson in the Confucian tradition is to say how to transform our being embedded in a particular condition into potentiality and instruments for self-realization.
But how do you?
Third excerpt coming up.
It's a scholarly tradition. It's a form of life. It's a way of learning to be human. Now, returning to your earlier question, if you look at China, not in terms of just one geographic location, but cultural China, meaning not only mainland China, but Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, or Chinese communities in Southeast Asia, in Australia, in New Zealand, in North America, and in Europe. This cultural China, many different people with different orientations, has been very much shaped by the Confucian project. Many people are not aware that they are Confucians, but they interpret their own human condition. They live by some of the basic Confucian ideas, and they transmit some of these values to their children.
It's in the cultural DNA, in a sense.
It's a cultural DNA. It's a marvelous way of putting it. And in the sense that education is absolutely crucial for self-development. We are human beings, to be sure, but learning to be human is an ultimate concern. I try to envision the Confucian project as a faith in the improvability and perfectibility of the human condition through self-effort, but not effort by isolated individuals alone, by the community as a whole. So you can envision the Confucian process of learning to be human in terms of a series of concentric circles. The idea of the self at the center, extending the self to the family, immediate family in particular, but to other members of the family in the clan organization, to the community, to the state, to the world at large, and beyond. So to be human in this case assumes a responsibility which is not just social, it's even cosmological, in the sense that what human beings eventually will be able to do will have powerful consequences for the ecosystem or for cosmos as a whole.
Okay. This is well over 10 years old, or maybe longer, older than that. Because I should explain, because he's so important, right? As a major contributor to contemporary thought on a global scale. I won't list the number of awards he's been given, the number of positions he's held, but the interesting thing is to note this, that he's equally fated, absolute red carpet, in Beijing, in Taiwan, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, and every Southeast Asian capital, and of course in the United States. So much so that obviously the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party decided that they needed him. And he's now been made lifelong distinguished professor at Peking University, which is held for the last 10 years, right? Still maintaining his position at Harvard, and several other positions internationally. Why is he so significant? Because he resonates in the Confucian world, which is roughly close to 2 billion people. He resonates. deeply. When he speaks, people understand, yes, that's me. And so much so that some of his language has been taken over by the Chinese government. They may not believe in it. They may use it out of expediency, maybe, but they use it. And language has a way of being very influential. So Xi Jinping's great mantra, harmony, not uniformity, is to me. He developed the whole concept. And his other contribution, related, is his contribution to Confucian thought, which is called in the literature the ecological turn. In other words, he has embedded the best of ecological thinking inside the Confucian tradition, which comes naturally if you think about it, because the Confucian tradition is based on the relationship between humanity, earth, and heaven. Not the religious heaven, not the religious heaven. He defines heaven as creativity in the civic space. That's heaven. Heaven is here. It's everywhere. It's universal. Heaven. Heaven, earth, and humanity. And he's, of course, deepened the Confucian understanding of earth. All right. So it's very important. You go to YouTube, put Tu Wei Ming, and you'll see endless number of talks, lectures, interviews, and so on. If you're interested in hearing more or some of his writings, they can be a little bit challenging at times. Okay. Finally, opening it up for maybe 5 minutes of questions, if there are any. I may or may not know how to answer them. Dialogue of civilizations. Yes.
The question that I put to Chandra.
Yes.
I'm wondering if we here could address that question.
Say it in one sentence or two.
Can we frame his thesis in a way that is more, or that it's less alienating and more
Invitational.
Sorry?
Invitational.
Not so much invitational, but more unifying.
Well, that's what the dialogical idea is about. That's what dialogue is about. To enter into dialogue, you have to approach it in the spirit of dialogue, which is to strive for common purpose, but making use of the richness of the diversity that's represented in the dialogue.
Can I have a quick follow-up?
Yes, yes.
I get that that is where you are driving this conversation.
Not just me, yes.
Yes. Yeah, not just you. But how would you reconcile your method with Chandran's book?
Well, I'm not so much focused on Chandran's book.
Yes, I know.
I think he's bringing to light, this is the way to do it, the deep resentment that is in the minds of many who have been subdued, if not resentment, then pain or grievance, that have been subdued by those who've been dominant and to some extent remain dominant even as we speak. And the way I think to handle it is dialogically. You don't react against it. You say, I'm listening to the pain. I know the pain is real. I know we have to relieve the pain. Now let's work out how we do it together. And once you do that, then he begins to say, yes, and I realize that there is, for example, in Malaysia, much that's wrong with Malaysia, and the supremacy of one ethnic grouping over others is a major problem, and I see that, and so on and so on. So that's the only way we can do it. You try and work together by acknowledging the pain of the other, and acknowledging the contribution you may have paid to the pain of the other. That's the key. For me, that is the key.
I was thinking of that song by Peter Allen, All the Sons and Daughters. What is it, running around the world, far away from their family and friends? Who knows where the journey ends? Sorry, I've missed a bit.
That's all right.
But this concerns me, is the breakdown of families. And I mean, I know in India, you know, they used to have 10, 11, 12, as many children as they could, so that they could support them.
Yes.
They could work and support them. The family unit was extremely important. But now, where we've got a whole lot, you know, we've got people moving from country to country without their families, isolated, which to me is a recipe for disaster.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and absolutely. And that's because, driven by poverty, some of the members of the family feel that the only way they can assist the rest of the family is by transporting themselves either as guest workers or more permanent workers in the more affluent West. And that is leading, as you say, to the breakup of some families. And that clearly is something that needs to be rectified. Now, that's where, for example, the Confucian tradition is so important. It places so much emphasis on the cohesiveness and the unity of the family. And that was one of the 5 layers that Tueming mentioned. And no doubt we can learn a great deal from that and might have application in non-Confucian parts of the world. So each tradition has something to offer which could be usefully applied outside of the tradition.
I'll just add something to that if I may.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that we elders need to respect their children, but children also need to respect their parents.
Absolutely.
And, you know, stop this blame game.
Yes, yes. Well, that's one of the important, there are weaknesses in some traditions of the East, of course, as seen from at least a Western lens, but there are some strengths. And the mutual respect of members of the family is one of the strongest elements of the Confucian tradition. Yeah.
Joe, Emily.
I'm so sorry. Yes.
I just, something I'm thinking on with this discussion is we're talking about a deconstruction of the authority of this 15%. But are we then not just trying to reframe the conversation within the dominant dialogue through speaking in this academic sense, through prioritizing dialogue? Are we then not just perpetuating the power of the dominant rather than reframing the whole conversation?
Well, no, dialogue, if you follow the philosophical principles I've enunciated, which are not peculiar to me, that takes you away from it because it forces any representative of a particular tradition to rethink dominant practice. As someone said, there is as much in common between Christianity and the dominance of the West as there was between Stalin and socialism. I mean, they were worlds apart. But so, I mean, one of the things that can be said, I think, without too much contradiction, is that the Sermon on the Mount counts for very little in the conduct of Australian or US politics or French politics. So those in the West who are aware of the noblest sentiments, and it's not just the Christian tradition, the highest, noblest sentiments of the Enlightenment, which is a Western, of course, contribution, would lead you to call into question much of what is happening, which is the bedrock on which Western dominance has been premised, including the structuring of the market. So it requires of you that you question the structures of dominance, and you do it yourself. You're not waiting for the other to say, excuse me. So you go into the dialogue understanding that you're going to ask some very painful questions about what makes you tick, your civilization, your culture, your nation, as well as listening to what others have to say. You have to engage in self-critical reflection on where you're at and the groupings and the identities that you represent, where they're at. So it's a very, if you like, a dialogue of this kind is a radical critique of all forms of dominance. If it's genuine, it could be pretend dialogue, which may not lead to anything like that. That's true.
Online question?
Yes.
There's one from Chandran Nair.
Yes.
You talk about dialogue being painful. Could you explain what you mean by pain? Maybe repeat it for people.
Yeah. Well, it simply means that when you are confronted, let's say in some kind of interaction, let's think of the Australian example, you have a very set of angry representatives of the Indigenous peoples, First Nations, using no holds barred language to describe their situation and what you've done to them, much stronger than anything Chandran has said. You just have to sit there and bear the pain for as long as it takes. You don't cut them and say, oh yes, but. No, you let them listen, you let them speak, you listen and listen and listen, regardless of how painful it might be. They might accuse you of genocide, they might. But you have to listen. And once they have said all that they can say, then you might want to ask some questions. So that's painful. Because at the end of the day, it's painful on two counts. You empathize with the sentiments of those who have been oppressed or downtrodden, and you come to the realization that the group with which you identify has historically borne a good deal of the responsibility for that happening. So it's painful on both sides. You're hearing what is significantly, you think, may be true, and you realize, well, you're implicated. Even if you didn't do it yourself 200 years ago, you are enjoying the fruits of that wrong that was committed 200 years ago. You're not letting it go. You're not saying you can have it all back. Not many Australians saying you can have it all back. How much should we give you back? No limits. There aren't many such voices. That's what can be rather painful. Okay, any more? Are we done? Yeah. One more, quick, very quick.
It was more an invitation to you just to say, do you see any major opportunities sort of in the short to mid-term for that kind of civilizational dialogue that you're speaking about?
Oh yes, it's going on big time in many parts of the world. Huh? I can't tell you. Oh, I'm sorry, yes. Is there much traction to the idea of intercultural or intercivilizational dialogue? Yes. I can't tell you numerically how many initiatives there are in this field, some scholarly, some cultural, some organizational, but I suspect they're in the tens of thousands, right? And I was involved in one small contribution, the establishment of a Centre for Dialogue at La Trobe University based on this. It survived for 10 years. It doesn't exist at the moment. Money. We weren't able to raise millions, they said. And if you don't raise millions, you don't exist as a centre. Okay, that's it, by the by. It's an issue. Yes, there are many, and there are, you know, major religious scholars, other intellectuals, poets, artists of various kinds, all very heavily involved in inter-civilizational, intercultural dialogue. Many initiatives connected with Australia's multiculturalism. They're not headline news, but they're happening, of course. It needs to be increased, enlarged very substantially to be able to have real visibility. That's still some way off. Okay, so finishing off, 3 or 4 minutes past 9. Next week, at the suggestion of one of our participants, Rod Bow, he suggested it would be good to hear from someone who's been closely involved with the emergence of the independence in the Australian political landscape. And I thought that was worth doing. And Rod has kindly issued an invitation on, and Alana Johnson, who's been the convener of Voices for Indie, where that whole movement started, and holds a number of other positions, will in fact be joining us next week. And she's on top of all these discussions that have been going on, and what some of those who've been elected, as well as those who weren't, are thinking, and what the vision is, and the base of support that has led to their recent relative success. So that'll be an interesting discussion with her. It'll be mainly question and answer, so it should be interesting. And our main guest remains as advertised, and that is Adrian Pabst, who is one of England's leading political thinkers, and in 2021 published a somewhat different book from the one that Chandran has discussed with us this evening, which is talking about this being a watershed moment, and you can understand why I thought we would ask him. He will discuss with us what he sees as this watershed moment and what are the opportunities. That's the whole message of his book, the opportunities for radical renewal as he sees them. So it should be a very interesting evening. There'll be lots of other things as well. And I hope we'll see all of you, with perhaps a handful of new friends, if we can manage it. We'll see. But thank you.